I have the privilege of moderating the next panel. This panel is about nonlinear paths through medical training, specifically medical school and the transition to residency. All of our panelists, who I'll welcome up to join me now, are brilliant, James Morgan, who's joining us, yeah. Are brilliant current students or recent grads of medical school who've taken especially creative paths through their medical training. I think they've all proven that there's more than one way to become a doctor in the age of AI. And they've all shared with me, sometimes the paths that they've taken have met some resistance along the way. So we have with us today Dr. James Diao, Dr. Shivangi Goel, and soon to be Dr. Morgan Cheatham. I've asked each of the panelists to introduce themselves, so why don't we just start closest to me, Morgan, and then James.
Okay, great. First, just want to say thank you, Raj.
Wait, is it on?
Can folks hear me? Oh, this is much better. Okay, great. First, just want to start by saying thank you for hosting us, Raj, Zach, and the rest of the team. It's a privilege to be here and have this conversation at such a unique moment in time. My name is Morgan Cheatham, and I'm a fourth-year medical student at Brown, where I'm interested in pediatrics and genetics, and I'm kind of progressing along that journey now. And in addition to medical school, I'm also a vice president at a venture capital firm called Bessemer Venture Partners, where I lead our investing strategy at the intersection of computation and biomedicine. So a lot of the companies that I have the pleasure of investigating from the investment side are things that I've been able to bring into the clinic, and I sincerely hope we get to talk a little bit more about that today. I think as it relates to this conversation, I will probably be a little bit more of a techno-optimist. And so in the spirit of keeping my intro brief, I just wanted to highlight a few of the ways that I've been using AI as a medical student now over the last few years. And in many ways, I think sharing the stage with my colleagues, we are the first cohort of students to go through medical training with generative AI at our fingertips. And so just highlighting some of these before I pass it to James, the ways I've used AI so far to study for step 1 and step 2, and yes, I managed to pass. I've been using AI scribes for documentation in the hospital, which has allowed me to focus on the patient that's sitting in front of me and not all the administrative burdens that we face as future physicians. I've been using AI for literature review, which has also doubled as a defense when I've been pimped on rounds by very intimidating attendings. I've also used generative AI to generate analogies for explaining things to patients, most recently explaining how a rare autoinflammatory disease was impacting a family at the NIH. I've used AI-based voice agents to practice patient interviews, really focusing on how to be more empathetic, more kind of thoughtful and intentional in how I interface with patients. And during my surgery rotation, despite not being a field that I plan to go into, I was able to upload a video off of a robot-assisted segmentectomy that actually analyzed key steps in the surgery I was a part of to help me understand what it was we were doing and why it mattered for that patient. And then the last thing I did most recently was I generated my ERAS headshot using AI. So with that, I'll pass to you, James.
Wait, I feel like we need a little more detail on that.
More detail on how I generated the headshot?
How did you generate the headshot with AI?
Oh, I took a really crappy picture of myself in my bathroom, and I needed to upload a headshot, and I used tools like Canva and some other like AI-based photo editing to make it look professional. And I showed it to my mentor at the NIH. He said it looked pretty good.
Fantastic.
Hi, my name's James Diao. I'm a PGY1, so first year resident in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I'm also a postdoc with Raj's group in the Department of Biomedical Informatics. And like Morgan, I also have a lot of optimism about the way AI can be integrated into medicine and into medical education. I think as someone who still remembers using GPT-2 to help one of my best friends draft his wedding vows and seeing just how horrible they were, and then seeing like the progression to ChatGPT and then to O1 and all the different capabilities that are happening at such a high pace, I think it's easy to view the future with a sense of who knows what might happen and where things might take us. And so I'm really excited to talk about these with all of you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shivangi Goel, and I'm really excited to be here as well. I'm currently a first-year resident physician in internal medicine at Columbia, and also an alumnus of Harvard's Medical and Business School. So really excited and happy to be back on the old stomping grounds. In my intro, I kind of wanted to share the concept of this nonlinear journey, as well as focusing on why we're so excited about AI, also an optimist, so kind of an imbalanced panel probably. I think what's nonlinear for me is that I always knew I wanted to be a physician, but I thought that there were other ways in which I could augment my patient care, which is why I've always been very engineering-centric and business-centric. And this actually resulted in me leaving medicine for a couple of years. I finished medical school, went to business school, and then left for a tech startup. And that's not very common in the field of medicine to, after that, decide to come back. And I'm really excited to kind of share with you all what that journey was like for me, how my medical school here at Harvard supported me, and ways in which we can encourage other people who take non-traditional journeys to come back into medicine and integrate all of their clinical and non-clinical interests so that we can improve patient care, the value of the care we're providing them, and overall, how we're integrating technology into healthcare outcomes.
Amazing. So I think you just started doing it, but this is really the first question that I have. So all three of you, I know this well, are superstars. It's worked out for you. You've taken, as the panel title says, nonlinear, very creative paths. I think that's probably a better word, creative paths through medical school and your medical training. And again, I think we can see that it's worked out for all three of you, but I imagine that it's not always been easy or straightforward, or you've been met with resistance, whether internal or external, for going on that particular path. So maybe you can just, get the audience kind of up to speed with specifically how you went through medical school. Morgan, I know you're almost done with it now, so how you're going through medical school, and what your path was, why you decided to maybe take time either away from medical school itself, what you did with that time, and then if you have a gap or you did something other than going sort of straight into residency, I think the sort of rationale or the reasons for that would also be very interesting. So maybe we could just start with what the path was for each of you, because I think it's totally unique and different, and then maybe tell us a little bit about some of the resistance or some of the challenges you faced along the way. Maybe James, we can start with you.
Of course, I'm very excited to talk about this. So I took a 6-year path through medical school, what I like to call the scenic route, or as what George Daly once told me was the remedial route. So I started out with my preclinical training, and as part of my program, the Health Sciences and Technology program, we were supposed to find a research group to contribute research towards a thesis during several of the semesters of preclinical training and throughout the summer. And I found a group that I was very excited about. I went to talk to one of my advisors, and he said, "This sounds great. We also have a colleague who recently left, started a company, and they're doing amazing work. You should talk to them." And ended up going through that process and finding a position with the machine learning team at PathAI. And I remember at the time, there was definitely some pushback from different advisors, people I trusted, who said things like, "Oh, is this just because they pay more? Or is it because, or you won't be able to publish your findings, they're not going to let you share the work that you do, they're going to profit off of it, and you're not going to gain as much learning, as much mentorship, as much ownership as you would have in a more standard academic environment." And I took the leap of faith anyway, because I got along so well with the team, and it turned out to be the complete opposite. It was an amazingly steep learning curve for me to be in a very different environment. It was a place where I was able to really thrive and contribute to finish a project developing AI to predict molecular biomarkers using cancer pathology slides, to publish that as lead author, to submit a patent application, and just to be actively involved in sharing that work broadly. And I think that's not the case everywhere. But I think that was one case of facing pushback and still being able to find that opportunity with help from advisors, of course, and make the most of it. So that was baked into the medical curriculum. That was not actually taking any time differently. It was just time that other of my classmates were spending in academic labs. And then after the first 2 years, before starting the clinical years, I was able to talk to someone after they themselves were giving a talk and interested in ways to get involved with the Apple Heart and Movement Study, which was being conducted in collaboration with Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I thought this is something I could learn a little bit from, contribute a bit to, and ended up getting talked into joining for a year full-time to take a leave of absence from medical school to work with the data science team at Apple. And it just seemed like a kind of opportunity that, once I continued along on the train of medical training, that would be hard to find similar learning opportunities for in the future. And so I took the leap, and it just so happened that this is when COVID happened, so a very different, remote type of experience. But spent that year away from medical school, working at Apple, came back for my clinical year, and so did my core clerkships at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and then took another year leave of absence. This was to go to the UK. So my wife and I both went there for master's programs. I went to study as a Churchill Scholar in science policy, following some advice from Raj and Zach and other folks who told me about how oftentimes the bottleneck for actually translating technology into clinical impact is less so on the details of the technology and often on all the Byzantine maze of policies, systems, incentives, other factors that are required to bring them to the bedside. And so had a really great opportunity to learn about that in a global context there in Cambridge for a year. Came back, 4th year of med school, got to really lean into a lot of the research projects I was excited about, and then find myself here now as a resident in internal medicine, and without any of the concerns that I had originally about taking time off affecting the trajectory of my clinical expertise and training.
I can go ahead and speak on this as well. I think, like James, in the beginning, there was pushback. I also had advisors telling me when I decided to formally just leave medicine, I wasn't taking a leave of absence. I had finished school and had decided not to apply to the match, that you won't be able to come back. This is like end game. You're leaving medicine. Are you sure you're okay with that? Are you going to regret this later? And at that time, I had made the decision to leave and go into a more like tech and business-centric medical application because I had already been training for medicine, and I knew I loved that, but I knew that there was something I was missing, which is something that was brought up in the previous panel of physicians see pain points, clinicians, patients, we see the pain points. But the developers of technology may or may not be seeing them. They do their research, they do the interviews, they do everything they can to really understand the details of what the problem is. But unless you're on the front lines, how can you really speak to what the exact requirements of a product or a feature can be? How can you really speak to if this product will actually get deployed in the market because it was approved by the FDA and is financially feasible for a hospital to take on as a new technology? And I knew that that's where I kind of wanted to make an impact as well, and I just didn't know it was possible to do both at this stage in my career. Given that I had this burning desire to go work in industry, I thought, okay, this is one decision or the other. I'm going to take this branch, and I'm just going to leave, and I hope I don't regret it. I'm 2 years into a medical technology startup, Iterative Health. It's based in Cambridge. And I was a senior product manager leading our clinical product strategy for developing AI technologies for gastroenterology care, both for physicians but also for pharma clients as well. And I'm really loving it. I'm getting to utilize my engineering mindset, business, poli-sci, medicine, but I'm missing that day-to-day patient care. And I remember talking to a couple of my advisors at HMS who I hadn't initially told about my decision to leave medicine, Dean Ed Hundert, he was the previous Dean of Medical Education at HMS, as well as Dr. Katrina Armstrong, who used to be the Chief of Medicine at Mass Gen and is now President of Columbia, I believe. And they both told me, it is possible. Who told you that you couldn't do that? We just haven't had someone do that in many, many years, so we'll help you get connected. And so a lot of the challenges I actually faced on the tail end of coming back into medicine were figuring out how to work in an infrastructure that wasn't really built for what you call sponsored grads or people who have completely left medicine and are choosing to come back. In a way, I was treated a little bit like an international medical graduate where I had to come back and try to do some clinical observerships because it had been 4 years since I'd last seen a patient. But I wasn't qualified to do that because of insurance purposes. And so figuring out the logistics and how I can actually get an ERAS token, how I can apply, how I can get a letter of rec from a provider I haven't worked with in 5 years, how I can make sure I get clinical rotation experience, which is something I hadn't done in so long before applying to residency, that was the challenge. And I was very grateful that there were mentors at HMS who helped me through that process. And it was a learning one. And I'm very hopeful that if we can help medical schools create better processes for reintegrating people who leave medicine but then choose to come back, that it'll enable a lot of people who left medicine for a variety of reasons to actually reintegrate back into the clinical workforce.
Very. Hello? Okay, great. So briefly just summarizing my journey into medicine, I grew up in the DC area, wanted to be a physician from a very young age. And funny enough, here I am sitting almost 30 and I'm still not a physician. So that tells you a lot about the path. When I was thinking about where I wanted to go for college, I was looking actually for the most expedited ways to go to medical school. So I applied to a number of the joint degree programs and chose Brown for the 4-year kind of guaranteed admission to medical school. I thought this was choosing the most expeditious path. But what in reality it ended up being was a time in my life where I could explore all of the other things outside of medicine that I'd been interested in because I had the security in the background that I knew at the end of the day, whether I studied art history or computer science, I could become a physician if I put the work in. So what that looked like for me is, I ended up studying a mix of computer science and applied math, and spent most of my summers in college, not in a wet lab pipetting like many of my classmates, but at a command line programming at different companies. I worked at a company called Kairos, which was founded by a physician, and then ultimately actually spent a summer at Goldman Sachs working on the healthcare banking team. So not your typical pre-med route. What both of these experiences showed me, though, is something that Zach has been championing for a long time in his career, which is, one, that medicine is a knowledge processing discipline, right? I was actually becoming familiar with all the ways that data was transforming the way we thought about everything from drug discovery to patient care to the way the system runs, but that there were two factors that could scale medicine beyond my own abilities. Right? I had grown up thinking the one-to-one patient-provider interaction was the only way I could have an impact in healthcare. And what I quickly realized was through big data, computation, what we now have rebranded to AI, and through capital, thinking about investment, which was more what I learned on the street, you could scale technologies in healthcare to have a broader impact. So you could go from this one-to-one sacred patient-provider relationship to this one-to-many relationship and how you can drive change. And that very much became my North Star. And so making a very long story short, when it came time my senior year to matriculate right into medical school, I describe it as I'd almost seen too much. I wasn't ready to put my head down for another 4 years and block out all these other things that had inspired me. And so through a random cold email, I joined Bessemer right out of undergrad. I didn't run a full recruiting process. I just kind of stumbled into it. Actually didn't really know what venture capitalists did. And what was supposed to be a quick 2-year deferral from medical school became 4. The pandemic hit. Healthcare technology was having a heyday, and I actually wanted to go back to medical school when I could really engage with everything in person, right? I didn't want to do anatomy lab online. I wanted to have that unique experience. Now, the one story I don't tell everybody, and I know there's a lot of people on the Zoom, so I'll be careful about all the details I divulge, but my path back to med school was not a slam dunk. My dean had graciously offered me, this additional time away, and at a certain point, he emailed me. He said, we're keeping this seat warm. You got to make a decision. And so I ultimately committed to go back to med school. But 3 weeks before then, one of the healthcare technology companies that I was working with actually had an entire leadership change and needed a CEO to step in. And so in a very, very long-winded story short, I ended up jumping into that company and running it as CEO for the first 9 months of my first year. And I think it was really during that time that I realized that you can't actually do it all. And it was one of those vulnerable moments of realizing patients deserve our focus. They deserve our undivided attention. And there are certain periods of your life where you can have this expansive view and try to do everything, but there's also moments where you really got to lock in and focus on becoming the best clinician you can. And so I think it was through this very roundabout story that I like gained an appreciation for how to navigate those different seasons of life. And now I'm, almost at the end of it, and I think have a few scars from along the way. But that was at least my journey.
Amazing. Thank you all. So, you've taken these very creative, non-traditional, non-linear paths through your medical training. I think really you've selected opportunities, experiences to teach yourselves, to learn things from other people, things that would not be part of the traditional medical school training or the undergraduate training, to stay at the forefront of technology, of AI, of computer science and medicine. And so we've heard these amazing ideas today. I think we've also seen this gradient. I think David Shaywitz had a nice tweet about this. The big theme, one of the big themes here is the big gradient in the use of these technologies amongst trainees, from students all the way to attendings beyond. And so we've heard these great ideas about how we might insert more material into the medical school curriculum. You can imagine this either being formal instruction on how we work with AI, right? How med students, how future physicians should learn to work with AI, understand its errors, its vulnerabilities, its competencies. And then we've also heard great ideas about, I think from you all, about let's say externships, ideas for things outside of medical training that might enhance your relevance and your pursuit of what you do afterwards, and even make you a better clinician. So we have things that we could add to the curriculum, right? So I really hate zero-sum thinking, but this really forces us, time is finite, forces us to think about what parts of the curriculum we might reshape or we might revisit that are there right now that we're doing instead of preparing physicians to work with AI and to work with technology. And so I'm going to open this up to any of you to start with, because it is a hard question. What parts of the curriculum do you think could be streamlined or condensed, or if you want to make this a little bit spicier, even replaced by preparing physicians preclinically to work with AI?
I'm happy to start here, and I will be the first to admit that coming back after many years and feeling initially a little insecure about my clinical knowledge starting residency because it had been so long, I've tried to not use many technologies or like AI tools to augment the clinical care I'm providing, but rather to verify the clinical care I'm providing, just so I can make sure my brain still works. But I would say that the biggest thing I think that needs to be added to clinical education, especially in the medical school sphere, rather than replacing an entire curriculum and having to take out like random segments of medical school that we have, is actually just teaching medical students that just because they received some information from a tool online does not mean it's accurate. You have to trust but verify. And there are so many tools out there. Initially it was just ChatGPT that we were using, and you might ask it a question. If it didn't know the mechanism of action of some sort of like new drug, then it might give you some wrong answer. And if you as a medical student are trusting in this whole process, then you might now go and tell the attending who's pimping you during rounds that, oh, that's the mechanism of action, get it completely wrong, or worse, hurt a patient. And so I think something that needs to be added to our curriculum is how to teach medical students to better understand the data that they're receiving, and also have the critical reasoning skills to be able to understand, is this accurate or not? And what other research do I have to do to prove to myself this is accurate? What can be replaced? I mean, I have to say our fourth year of medical school was pretty relaxed. I won't say belabor this point too much, but there were multiple months where we're not necessarily doing heavy clinical work, and I think it could probably just be added there. We had a course called Essentials as well. Did you take that? Yeah, we had a course called Essentials, which had really important things like ethics, epidemiology, biostatistics at HMS, and I think a segment like that could probably add it to a course.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like there are so many topics that are relevant to the practice of medicine that aren't necessarily within the core sphere of medicine that find its way into the curriculum through, if you went to Harvard Medical School, classes like Essentials, which are built in and not like a semester-long deep dive into the subject, but just giving you the basics of, healthcare economics, about things like ethics, things like empathy, communication, and so on. And I think that in my head, things about leveraging AI and new tools would fit in well into that type of structure, mostly because I think you can't really give someone a full education on these topics within the already bursting at the seams structure of medical school. I think the better way is to plant the seed so that people will become interested, so that they can seek knowledge on their own, find knowledge through other programs. The amount of knowledge now out there that you can learn on your own, just free, online, has never been more accessible and more high quality. I think also, if we're going back to this topic of what could be cut down, so I think there's a reason why there's so many jokes about forgetting the Krebs cycle. I feel like the Krebs cycle is fundamentally important to a lot of processes in medicine, but knowing the names of all the enzymes, the whole step one by one, the level of detail that is often asked of you to do really well on step one and sometimes step two as well. Even as someone who loves this stuff, as a biochemistry major in college, as one of my majors, I still feel that this is one of the subjects that, as medicine starts moving more and more towards and growing, and in terms of the volume of material that's asked of medical students to learn, I think that is one of the ones that we can start with revisiting and seeing, do we really need to know all those enzymes, and what other trade-offs are coming from us spending time on those?
Though when I did show up to the NIH on the purine and pyrimidine metabolism unit, I was expected to know all of those things, and I definitely did, and so I had to look them up. But to your point, I think the level of detail is often context dependent in medicine, and AI is a really interesting technology for thinking about injecting that context and equipping the physician with that context depending on the environment they're traversing. I'll be a little provocative here on this question. I think the first point I would make is replacement, whether it's in medical education or it's even in the hospital, I think evokes this very visceral sense of rejection from people, whether it's replacing our jobs, whether it's replacing content that we want to teach future physicians. And so I guess what I would reframe this question as, Raj, is really like a reimagining or an integration of AI technology into existing curricula. So a simple example would be, we have OSCEs during the first few years of medical school, and those are often case-based simulations with a patient actor in a simulated exam room. And I'm really fascinated by this new technology that's emerged with voice-based agents, where you can have a conversation, as many of us have seen with 11 Labs or the new OpenAI model, with an AI agent. And that AI agent can simulate a number of different scenarios. It could simulate a patient who feels disgruntled and who feels like they haven't been listened to by the medical system. It could present a patient maybe facing cognitive decline. I mean, there's a number of things that these models could simulate for us. And what would it look like for, 3 of the 10 OSCEs you do in a year to be with one of these models so that you can gain familiarity with it, understand how it works, and also derive the additional benefits that using AI can provide? For example, assessing your tone, the speed with which you speak, whether you were empathetic, how long you waited till you interrupted the patient, because we all know the stat that it's like not a lot of time until doctors are interrupting. So I think for the existing things that we already do in medical school that have become tradition, we should interrogate each of them in isolation and ask ourselves, is there a way to integrate AI into this? The analogy I would draw is, I think for those of us up here, we're old enough to remember typing class, like back in grade school. Like, you went and you took a class and you learned how to type, you learned how to look stuff up on the internet, you learned how to verify sources. Like, these are all things that we don't really do anymore because they're just inherently a part of every activity. And I think if we create a separationist framework for learning about AI, it's really not going to gain the traction that it could in the curriculum. The last comment I'll make, and this is the most provocative one, is just I think the whole preclinical experience can be reimagined. I mean, there are brilliant professors who are lecturing students for the first 2 years or first year of medical school, and I'll speak from my own experience. I would say a majority of those lectures are attended by like 5 people each, in a class of 140. Like, they are not very well attended because students appreciate that to learn the volume of information that's required in the preclinical years, oftentimes you're better off pursuing a personalized learning strategy that best suits your needs for how you can ingest all that information. So I would really encourage us to interrogate the preclinical years. Again, whether that needs to actually be a 4-year MD program, or whether we could even explore scenarios where maybe you take step 1 to get into medical school, right? Maybe the $250,000 commitment to go to medical school could be half of it, right? Or maybe we expand the amount of clinical time that you're spending in the hospital versus 12 to 18 months of sitting at home watching lectures. So that would be the area that I would focus on, and then I would continue to think about the integration-first approach for the clinical years.
So just to push more on that. So I think the first thing, if I'm hearing correctly, is integration. It's not a sort of we have to add it or remove something. Integration throughout the curriculum, and maybe even outside of considering AI, reimagine the preclinical curriculum. And then the second point, and I think you just hit it at the end there, is that maybe there is the opportunity, or maybe this is actually the question for you, is there the opportunity, or could you imagine another type of care provider? So I don't have a great name for this, but let's call them an AI operator. They're not a physician, they're not a nurse, right? They haven't gone through, they're not another type of care provider or pathway that we have well established, but they are someone who is an expert at working with AI that maybe has gone through a shorter training path than med school, which is 4 years in the US, 4 years of undergrad, 4 years of medical school, 3 years plus of residency, usually many more, often many more. They've gone through a streamlined experience where they're very, very good at working with AI and providing maybe support to those other folks in managing patients or managing care. Could you imagine another type of person who's delivering care in the age of AI, who's gone through a streamlined medical experience? And the answer could be no for social or technical reasons. The answer could be yes. Probably would require both social and technical support for that to happen. Maybe Morgan, just expand upon what another care model could look like with AI at our fingertips.
So I don't suspect that there will be another advanced practice provider who is specialized in providing care with AI. I can't see that for a number of reasons. Governing bodies in medicine, I can't imagine them being very excited about that. I think there would be a lot of shortcomings to the level of experience those individuals have, and I think you'd be concerned about, autonomously enabling someone to provide care who hasn't gone through the well-trodden, evidence-based path that we go through. But what I will say is the actual role of the physician, I think, is increasingly becoming unbundled. I wrote down a few of the tasks that we do as physicians. We engage in, patient care. So we take histories, we take physical exams, we interpret labs, we diagnose, we generate treatment plans, we communicate with other colleagues, with patients, we do documentation. If you go across each of those activities, and of course, there's things on that list that I've not mentioned, I think that we will start to carve away segments of those activities that AI can take on. And we're already seeing this with documentation, where folks are using ambient scribes, right? We used to have human scribes who would follow us around, and many settings still do, but they're taking on that burden of documentation from a generation task for the physician to more of an editing, more of an oversight task. And so that's where I see the biggest impact happening. And then, of course, I think the actual IT department of providers and health systems and hospitals are certainly beefing up to meet this need, but they're doing so in the context of a very margin-constrained environment where they don't have a lot of resources necessarily to spend on AI and new talent. So I think we have to be thoughtful about bloating kind of the labor force in the setting of these shortages and budget constraints.
I totally agree. I think I see less of a role for a new position and more just, like Morgan already mentioned, carving out parts of the physician role or other provider roles and enhancing them that way. I think another angle that I think will be increasingly important as AI becomes more sophisticated is the patient as AI operator. I've already had experiences where I've had friends, young, very tech-savvy friends who came to me with questions about their ankle that wasn't feeling well, and they already had been able to ask about a differential, ask about the Ottawa ankle rules, and just having just much more knowledge about this topic from being able to have back and forth conversations with ChatGPT than most patients would normally be able to have. And I think my hope is that in the future, the patients being the masters of knowledge on their own condition and their own experience and their values can be able to have some of these conversations ahead of time with language models to be able to arm themselves with what questions they really need to be prepared for when they have their not enough time with the clinician, as we know is all too common the problem, to be able to really make the most of that limited time and to best advocate for themselves and their care.
Yeah, I don't have anything incredibly new to add here. I think both of them have kind of articulated what I think as well. The scope of the physician has increased so much in the past couple of decades, far beyond clinical care or like clinical care in the inpatient or outpatient setting. And I think rightfully so. Patients these days struggle a lot more with social determinants of health than I think ever before because disparities are increasing more and more. But one experience that I have currently is on one of my inpatient services. I spend more time talking to nursing homes and rehab centers and insurance companies than I actually do with my patients, even more than writing notes, which is really hard to believe. And I think there's so many use cases for an AI-enabled practitioner or just other practitioners who have the ability to leverage these tools to be able to communicate with outside providers, with these SNFs, with these rehab centers, with the insurance companies with prior auth, as someone was previously mentioning at the panel, that don't necessarily have to do with clinical care, but will significantly streamline a physician's experience when they're taking care of their patients and enable us to be better physicians as well.
Amazing. So I think that's a good transition point. We want to open it up to the audience. So if you're here in person, can go to one of the two mics. We'll call on you. And if you're online, you can type your questions into the YouTube chat, and we'll pose them here for you. So please go ahead. Please introduce yourself first, and then fire away.
I'm Dave DeBroncard. I'm an evangelist for rethinking the doctor-patient relationship as an empowered patient. And I've got to say, as I looked at the program for this event, I thought, what the heck does nonlinear paths have to do with AI? But like, I get it. You are the ones who say, hey, why do we have to do things the old-fashioned way, right? And that's a big deal. And one of my gripes in the last 10 years has been that when medical students deal with a standardized patient, right, a patient actor, none of the patient actors are trained on how to act like Courtney Morales Hoffman, right? Somebody who is informed before she gets there, right? As a result of which, what I keep hearing from other activated patients is they go to the doctor and the doctor is like puzzled, like, what do I do with this? This kind of patient doesn't exist. And I wonder, so do we have, I think you gave a glimpse of hope here. What do we do to get into the routine that these patient actors, a certain percentage of them are trained to act like Courtney? Anybody?
Is your question, how do we train patient actors to simulate experiences where patients have read about their conditions online or they've interacted with AI to interrogate their condition more deeply before speaking to a physician?
No, my question is, what has to change? The current reality today, as I understand it, the last time I dug into this was 5 years ago, was that the standardized patients are given various personalities to enact, to embody, and none of them involve being an empowered patient, right? You can have somebody who's worried, you can have somebody who acts different ways, but none of them have been trained to do that. What has to change out there? Is it ABIM? Is it ACGME? I don't know. Who has to be taught that this kind of person should be simulated in the training? Am I making any sense, or am I...
I totally agree that medical education right now tends to view the patient in a very passive role, where the medical student or the trainee is basically tasked with this puzzle hunt of trying to elicit from the patient the correct answers and get the right labs to find the right answer. And I think it's much harder to have one where all of the interactions that become so important in the practice of medicine, such as working with colleagues who are much more knowledgeable than yourself on a certain topic, consultants who are going to contribute expertise on a certain topic, trying to combine this together, and like you've already mentioned, an active patient who is very well versed on their condition and who is a strong advocate for themselves. I think one challenge with that, and the reason why it's been less accessible in medical education today, is that it often requires somebody to fulfill that role in a way that requires expertise and from someone who's an expert. So for example, one of the things that I learned a lot from was not just the standard lecture format, but afterwards, small section where we were able to learn with a GI fellow and go back and forth with the fellow on a certain case and try to figure it out together. And I feel like that's something that previously you would need a GI fellow or someone who knows more to be able to fill that role. And to be able to have someone who can fill that role from the patient side, from the consultant side, from expertise side is not always easy. But I'm hopeful that, as Morgan alluded to with the voice-based chatbots, there are going to be more opportunities to try to incorporate a more active role of other relationships that are involved in the practice of medicine that I'm hopeful can be incorporated into medical training.
Hello, I'm Luigi De Angelis. I'm a medical doctor from Italy, currently enrolled as a Master in Public Health student at the Harvard THN. Something I noticed in all of your three paths, a common element was interacting with industry at a certain point. And most of the time, we know that industry can offer a different perspective. And that this is particularly true for AI in healthcare, because you can really witness what it's like to build an AI product and all the challenges. So I was wondering, do you think that it might be useful to teach math students about general principles of entrepreneurship, giving them opportunities, just like what James did, to have practical experiences during their during math school? And can this really make them understand what's AI in healthcare more than just teaching them what is an activation function and a deep neural network?
Why don't we start with Morgan for that one?
I'm reticent to say that we should add more to the curriculum, appreciating how challenging that can be. And I also think we come back to like our fundamental reason of going to medical school. It's to care for patients, right? I had to grapple with this like at a very, very deep interpersonal level, right? Some people might say, oh, so-and-so is going to med school so they can do biotech investing, or so-and-so is going to med school so they can do healthcare entrepreneurship and have that credential next to their name. Ultimately, a lot of what you learn in med school can be learned online, can be read online. The things that you cannot do are practice medicine, are seeing a patient in front of you and being responsible for their care, their worries, their doubts, their fears, their concerns. And so, no, I don't think we should add more curriculum around entrepreneurship. What I think we should do, though, and I think that my fellow panelists have articulated this well, is for medical trainees who are interested in entrepreneurship, let's unburden them from the pressure of having to conform to the traditional path. You want to take a year off to go start a company? Great, we'll support you. Your seat is warm, go do that, we'll be here when you get back. And there are plenty of medical schools that already do this today. Let's not do the kind of half-baked version of that, which is, oh, well, you can do entrepreneurship as part of this small club, and you can do it for part of your time, and you can only do it at our institution with your classmates, and you can't get exposure to industry. Like, that does nobody any good, because if you want someone to be best in class at someone, let them go flourish and learn from those who are best in class. I think that there's too much of an emphasis on keeping people contained and keeping people on the path that's going to look good for whatever the next step is. And ultimately, if we all think about the physicians who have changed the world and who have inspired us, how many of them actually stayed on one path, right? How many of them actually pursued a conventional process? I think very few. And so my takeaway to answer your question succinctly would be, let's just make it easier for people to go have those experiences and come back. And when they come back, let's welcome them with open arms versus kind of having the whole industry stigma conversation.
Yeah, I have to agree wholeheartedly. I think, at least in the US, when we're paying upwards of $250,000, we should have like generalizable curriculum that is very focused on patient care with the opportunities to learn from industry, as you were mentioning. And so I think one thing that might be helpful is having more alumni who may have gone into industry, whether full-time or part-time, who also do patient care maybe, come back and speak versus those kind of alumni being a little bit more hush-hush as the individuals who left medicine. Allowing for people to learn from all these alumni or having mentorship programs if you are in fact interested, so that if you wanted to take a gap year and pursue another opportunity, you could. And I think if we do all of that, we'll incentivize a lot more people to explore those opportunities versus having that what if and feeling that financial burden at the end of medical school, going into residency and going into some sort of existential crisis, but rather knowing in your mind that I do have the opportunity if I want it, and I chose to do it or not do it, and now I'm happy with my decision. And I have enough knowledge and resources and a network that if I wanted to pursue something in industry down the road, I feel comfortable doing so.
Hi. I think this panel was particularly more interesting to me because
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, because I'm freshly graduated from undergrad, planning to go to med school and spending some gap years, trying to explore my interest in computer science as well. And my question for you is, as someone who has seen where the recent trend is being headed in fields like finance or tech, how do you see the role of physicians evolving in clinical settings, maybe like 20, 30 years? Because there are some people out there saying that, oh, jobs are being replaced, or there may be a third party that's not a physician, not insurance company, not patient. There will be another different thing. But what was your personal experience as somebody who's came back to medicine after having explored all these things?
I think it's people every year are trying to predict what's going to happen to each different field. And I think we've seen how it's so hard to make these predictions. I think it was Jeff Hinton who predicted that radiologists would be obsolete and we should stop training them by, I forgot what year.
Wile E. Coyote, right? Like going off the cliff. Yeah.
And yet now we're seeing radiology having like one of the biggest surges of applicants. And so I'm not saying that, like, you know, it's a foregone conclusion. Medicine is going to stay roughly the way it is in the near future. I think back to this one statement that I think about a lot, which is we often underestimate, or we often overestimate what's going to happen in the next couple years, and then underestimate what's going to happen in the next 10 years or more. And I think it's a similar kind of thing where it's just, you know, if you ask people way back when what the future would look like, they would think about flying cars. And I think from a similar stance, us trying to project what medicine's going to look like with AI at the pace that it's evolving is very hard to predict. And so I think for someone who's in this very early stage of their career, thinking about how best to position themselves for the future, I think there's a lot to be said for trying to stay upwind of where things are moving quickly, try to be involved with those, and even if it's the case that, you know, you get involved with it and it becomes obsolete later, you at least are part of that progression where you know what problems are being addressed by the next wave, and maybe have more data points to where the next part is going. And I know that's very vague, and it's like harder to like act on that or to have actionable takeaways from that. But I think the way you're thinking about it with you know, exploring more of what's happening in computer science, what's happening in the world of AI, is, I think, a very thoughtful way of trying to approach this very fast-changing landscape.
Congratulations on finishing undergrad very recently. I think I was actually thinking of this exact question just a couple of days ago, and because I have this patient who has heart failure, and they end up in the hospital over and over again with acute decompensated heart failure because no one can really predict when they're going to have their flare. There's so many different kinds of data that we're able to now obtain from patients that we weren't able to before. This patient's part of a Bluetooth-enabled, like remote heart failure monitoring clinic where we can track their weight. They put in on a daily basis what their fluid intake is, what their diet's like. They fill out surveys of how they're feeling these days. And there is someone who's sitting at the computer, typically a nurse or another person who has significant clinical training, who looks through that data and is like, I think this person might have a flare, let me reach out to them. But that's based off of a very generalized pool of patients that is not personalized to that individual. And I was thinking, how can AI help us here? We could probably look back at all the times each individual patient has had a flare and understand what were the instigators and to what degree did they gain weight, how much more fluid did they have, how much worse did they feel, and we could potentially predict when they're more likely to have flares. So I don't think AI is going to replace a clinician. I think it's just going to make our care so much better and enable us to help patients in a way that we weren't able to do before, because now instead of being very reactive in the healthcare we provide, maybe we can be more proactive.
Great. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello, my name is Nora. And like you guys, I'm also taking a non-traditional path to medicine. So just very briefly, I'm doing research in dermatology at the Brigham right now, and I did my master's in undergrad, and then I'm applying to medical school. So the long way about. And as she said as well, she's also taken a few gap years. So what I'm curious about is how has your experience, each of you, having taken years off before going to medicine as opposed to your peers who have gone directly, how has that enriched your experience? And also, how is that setting you apart in the sense of, do you think that you practice right now medicine in the exact same way that your peers are, like as a resident or soon to be resident, hopefully? Or do you think that you're practicing in the exact same way, even though you did take time off and you did learn things that, for example, your peers don't know, like working at an AI company? So yeah.
And it was a tremendous. It's given me tremendous strengths, I think, in medical school to have had other experiences. Let's take AI out of the picture. Going to medical school a little bit later after having had a real job on a payroll, working on teams, navigating challenging situations with people, having to kind of learn on the job and be responsible for your own learning, which is basically what happens once you get to medicine. 100% would recommend it. Once you're in the hospital, there's a number of really challenging situations that can emerge, and the ability to knowing how to navigate those and how to communicate effectively with people across all walks of life is something that you learn in the real world. And I think that AI aside, that was tremendous. I was a student of the healthcare system in venture capital from people who were actively trying to change it and reimagine it. And so for me, I think being dropped into a community hospital, it's almost like I'm having like a revelation of here are all the things. Knowing what I learned in venture, knowing what I know about technology, knowing what I'm reading in the AI research and the literature, that can be changed. And so I think I come to it with a sense of optimism. And in a way, I think it's helped me battle burnout and confront burnout, because I feel a sense of empowerment and agency of, yeah, this problem is really hard and a lot of people are being impacted by it and there's others who are disgruntled about it, but there are actually tactical solutions. And throughout my training, I've tried to integrate those things, whether it's working with my fellow residents, fellows, attending, to say, we have this problem, there's this tool that I learned about, we should try to use it, or there's this group that's working on this thing that I learned about in my other walk of life. And I think you can get that whether you work in venture capital, sure, but whether you do research beforehand, pursue your own entrepreneurial venture, or just gain experience in another dimension. I would also add, working in policy and regulation as another axis for exploring these things.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. I think we have a question from our online audience.
Yes, we have a question from Satish Kumar, who is the founder of Suparna Health AI, and he's asking Morgan, is there any standardized checklist or scenarios for different kinds of disease scenarios and situations against which voice chatbots can be refined? And this is for education or even for hospital use. And he is talking on the lines of the book Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande.
Defer to my fellow panelists in this question because I'm not familiar with any specific checklist other than evidence-based guidelines on a disease-specific basis for voice-based agents. I'll also just mention, which we haven't maybe dug into deeply here, most of the applications in voice so far that we've seen that have gained traction are actually been on the operational and administrative side. So, a very tactical example would be you have a patient who's coming in for, a robotic segmentectomy. That patient needs to have PFTs and echo and lab work done before they come in. For those of us in the room who've gone through this, what % of the time does the patient show up on the day of the surgery and there's no PFTs to be found, the echo is up in the air, and you're waiting for the labs, and then the case gets canceled, and then that patient's care is delayed. So one interesting application I would just share that's outside of the clinical realm and more in the operational realm is empowering nursing coordinators with AI agents to actually automate phone calls to patients, to labs, to imaging centers to facilitate the coordination of all of those steps to prepare for surgery, and then support the patient and their data, really, through the perioperative process. So if anyone has anything to add on the clinical side, I'd be curious, but I haven't seen much there yet.
We have another question from Toby Brown for the panel broadly on what AI literacies should physicians of the future learn?
Actually, could you clarify the question? I think we didn't hear it fully.
Yeah, sorry. It was about what AI literacies should physicians of the future have? Like, what's AI skills and understanding of AI should they have, I think, is if I had to translate. Yeah.
So back to, you are in charge of the curriculum today. What are you preparing your medical students graduating and about to go into residency with in terms of AI knowledge? What do they need to know?
I think the first thing is to know the basics of how language models generate their output. Even just the autocomplete analogy, as flawed as it is, having a sense of what the models are trained on and what kind of weak points they can keep an eye out for, how to second guess the models, and which things they're particularly good at, which things they're less good at, I think is really important. There's one more thing I was going to say, but I'll pause there for anyone else.
James remembers what he was going to say. I'll keep stalling. I'll filibuster for you. So I will actually not be didactic here. I'll just say use this stuff as much as possible. It's changing so much. Just last week and earlier on the panels, folks were talking about Notebook LLM, where you can dump in a YouTube video or a bunch of medical textbooks. I dumped in the Thompson & Thompson Genomics Bible and generated a biochemistry podcast with the click of a button. I mean, every week there's a new drop. So instead of kind of telling you what you have to know, because I'm probably going to be wrong by next week, I'd say use it as much as you can. Trust but verify. And if you're interested in contributing to the discourse, one of the most interesting but unsexy problems to solve is this challenge of evaluation and benchmarking. And I think what I mean by that and what was alluded to earlier is the best way to measure the performance of these things is not whether or not it can pass a U.S. medical licensing exam, because frankly, no one cares. And even residency programs are looking at those scores, but not weighting your whole application on them today, but really refining with a clinical perspective. How do I know if this system is performing as it should? How do I know if it's generating value for the patient, for the physician, for the whole care team, right? And that would be something that I would advise people to look into actually with more academic rigor and more focus. But otherwise, just use this stuff as much as you can and figure out the corner cases and where it works and where it doesn't.
I remember now. So it was basically about making sure that clinicians know about the pace of progress. I think it's really easy for clinicians and trainees to really index on what it can do now and just like over-fixate on a couple bad mistakes that can happen today while losing track of this context of today is already like 10 times better than 2 months ago, is already 100 times better than 2 months before that. And I think just showing some of the trajectory that it's already gone through to get to the point where we can criticize it for something that would have been miraculous a year ago is important context, I think, for clinicians to know so that they can be excited enough to, as Morgan recommends, to really lean in, to explore other opportunities for using it, and then to keep in mind that this is not going to be just like the way it is forever.
All right, terrific. We are right at time, so please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.